The Zlin Aviation Savage Bobber is a customizable microlight bush plane that can be built to order to suit the needs of any pilot and gets its name from customizable motorcycles like choppers and bobbers. HobbyKing did a fantastic job of building a 1000mm ARF of this very unique bush plane. What's up everybody, I'm Adam, you're watching Model Aviator, and this week we have a new release from HobbyKing, the 1000mm or 39-inch wingspan Savage Bobber ARF. Let's get right to it. So first things first, when we received our Savage Bobber, the actual ARF box was then a much larger box and it had been wrapped in some pretty soft paper type stuff. And that's a good thing. There was some damage to the outer box, but the very tightly packed box that the actual ARF came in was untouched and all the parts were in good nick. So from there, we got started on the build, and this is one of those rare times where we actually did a build video, a very detailed build video. So we'll put a link in the description and at the end of this video to that episode. It is as long and as detailed as it is for two reasons. One, we wanted to make sure that anyone that had any questions about the Savage Bobber and how it goes together, that those questions would be answered. And two, we wanted it to serve as an instructional video for somebody that has never done anything like building an ARF, to maybe help them and guide them if they decided to get into something like this. So that's why it's long. But any questions you have about how this thing goes together should be answered in that video, so check that out. As far as my impressions of the build are concerned, there was nothing exceptional about the Savage Bobber. It wasn't the hardest, nor was it the easiest ARF that I've ever built. It was pretty much average. I didn't run into anything building this airplane that I wouldn't expect to run into with most ARFs. So pretty much a no-brainer there. So after the build, we got her set up and took her out for Maiden Day, and we're going to do something a little different with the format. We're actually going to show you the footage from our Maiden Day. The airplane flew good, but it had some characteristics that I wasn't particularly fond of, so we ended up making some changes after that. So check out our first day. We'll talk about during the footage what it was doing that we didn't like, and then we'll meet you back here and we'll tell you about the changes we made and then show you some flying footage after the changes. So check out Maiden Day. Our first takeoff, there were pretty much no issues. That sound you heard was the fact that the large tail wheel, there's barely enough room to get the wheel collar to hold that in place, and the screws that hold the two tail wheel halves together actually rub up against the landing gear wire, so that's the sound that you were hearing. After we got her trimmed out, it was time for the stall tests. This will be the clean stall. And it just drops the right wing slightly. Easy neutralization of the controls, and it flies right out of it. And now we've got full flaps, so this will be the dirty stall. Gets a little bit slower and then does the same thing with the same recovery. Here's our maiden landing, and what you're going to see here becomes a trend. Touchdown, and I can't hang on to it and keep it straight. That was our second takeoff, and notice that the airplane went right just a bit. That was because during trimming I had to use an inordinate amount of right rudder to keep the plane trimmed at cruising power. And now our second landing. And you'll see the same thing. As soon as I touch down, even though I correct properly with the rudder, the plane kind of has a mind of its own. This will be our third takeoff. And again, because of the rudder trim I'm having to use, you'll notice that it's going to go to the right again. It doesn't really stabilize, and the trim doesn't really work well until I'm at cruising speed and cruising throttle. And here's our last landing. And again, I just can't hang on to it. This is our first attempt at a roll, and you'll notice I give up on it halfway through and just pull it through because the roll rate is so lethargic. Okay, so there's the footage from our first day with it, and something that I want to point out. Some of you may know that there's another company that makes a Savage Bobber ARF this exact same size. And the videos of that are pretty much a hot mess. People have a really difficult time with that. So when you see our Maiden footage, the fact that it flew is an improvement over some of the things that we've seen with the other one. Most of the footage of people with that on their first day are of them crashing it. So the HobbyKing ARF is exactly what Stuart said that it was. It is better in that it does fly good. It did fly well. But it had a couple of characteristics, as we talked about, that I thought I could improve. And just worth pointing out is that with ARFs, this is kind of how things go. A lot of times during a build, especially if you're not doing a review on it, you can just do whatever you want to do to it. People make changes. There were things about this airplane that I felt like during the build we'd be changing, but I wanted to fly it as built first and see how it did, and then see if what I had in mind really needed to be done and if it would make a difference. So that's kind of how our process was since we're reviewing this. So it did fly well, but we made a change or two, and now it flies even better. So we're going to tell you what we did. So the first thing I wanted to address was the fact that I needed more right rudder trim than I felt like I should be using to make the airplane track straight. And obviously I trimmed it at cruising throttle, so it was causing me a little bit of an issue under takeoff power. Initially the airplane was wanting to go right because that rudder trim was a lot more effective with a lot more power. And I just didn't like that. I felt like maybe changing the thrust angle might correct that problem and eliminate the need for so much rudder trim. So we put a single washer between the firewall and the mount and the top left mounting bolt, and that gave us more down and right thrust, hopefully to eliminate the need for that trim. So the second thing that I wanted to eliminate was the problem that we were having with the ground handling. You saw on the geotextile when I would land it, I just could not keep control of that tail and keep the airplane straight. I was digging wings in. We also had a problem with the plane nosing over in grass, and that's something that I expected when we built it. I've always thought that these Savage Bobbers, at least the models, that the gear was farther back than it needed to be. So to eliminate that, one of the things that we thought about was actually moving the entire gear forward and just mounting it differently. But to do that, we'd have had to add a good bit of weight to reinforce the areas not intended for gear to move it forward. We wanted to keep it basically where it was, but eliminate that problem. So we did a couple of things. The first thing we did is we built a shim to put underneath the back mount that rakes the gear forward. And you can take a look at this. This is just some balsa and light ply that we put together to make a channel for the rear landing gear wire, so we can use the straps and be screwing into light ply, but we didn't want to use really thick ply because we didn't want to add a bunch of weight. So there's balsa and light ply to make this. This is about a 1/4 inch thick total. and it actually ends up raking the gear forward a little more than a 1/4 inch, which really helps. It's past that pivot point now where the gear was, where when you get the airplane level, it actually wants to go over on the nose more than it wants to bring the tail down. And when the gear's in a position like that and that tail is that light, you have nose over troubles and you have a hard time keeping control of the tail, especially on a smooth surface, because it's just always so light. The other thing we did is we changed the angle of attack to give us more of a mechanical advantage and make it harder for the airplane to basically pivot over, to give it further to go. And the way we did that's twofold. We actually bent the gear in and then adjusted the wheels so that the main landing gear stance is not quite as wide and low as it was stock. And the second thing we did is we put a smaller rubber tail wheel that does two things. Because it's a smaller tail wheel, it actually lowers the tail and raises the nose, which gives us a little bit more angle of attack, but also because it's rubber, it actually grips really well and kind of grabs a hold of the geotextile. So we were hoping that all those things would eliminate our ground handling issues. And finally, the last thing that we wanted to address, and this is another thing that I knew I'd address, but again, we just wanted to fly the airplane as is before we started making changes, and that is there's a huge hinge gap to make those ailerons match up with the outer edge of the wing, as you can see here. And when you have a huge hinge gap like that, it causes some really funky aerodynamic stuff to happen there that make the ailerons much less effective. When that hinge gap is sealed, the ailerons are a lot more responsive typically. So we sealed that. I've seen people use colored electrical tape. I've seen them use clear tape, but if you use clear tape, you can still see kind of that ugly gap. I don't like to see that anyway. We had some yellow Ultracoat laying around that matched this, so we just took our covering iron and used Ultracoat to seal that gap, as you can see here. The idea behind that was to hopefully make the ailerons properly responsive. You saw in the footage from the first day, I did a roll and had so little confidence in the airplane's ability to finish that roll. They were so lethargic that I just tucked it under and pulled it through rather than risk trying to finish the roll. So how did all these changes work? What effect did it have on our performance? Well, let's take a look. So second day, first flight after all the changes. We had reset the trims all back to neutral, and as you can see, there was no tendency for the airplane to go right. And I do a little bit of trimming. Still needed just a little bit of right rudder, but not an inordinate amount. It was a normal amount of trim and had the airplane flying great. We set our Savage Bobber up to have scale power, and it does. What you saw there was pretty much the extent of our vertical capability. In slow flight, with full flaps down, the bobber flew really well. It inspires confidence and didn't really appear to have any bad habits. On landing, when the Savage Bobber gets in ground effect, when it decides to stop flying, it drops rather abruptly. You have to come in with some power to get a good flare, and I don't do that here, as you can see. Our gear mods appear to be on point in the grass. The takeoffs were a breeze, and the landings, whether I dropped it in behind the throttle curve or nailed it perfectly, we didn't have any nose-overs. As you can see there, the Savage Bobber responded well to a scale STOL takeoff technique of engaging the flaps to get the airplane off the ground a bit sooner. And here, doing a little slip to landing. Like any general aviation airplane inspired by a Cub, the Savage Bobber turns much better when you coordinate rudder and aileron, and slipping a bush plane down to landing like we're doing here again is one of my favorite things to do with airplanes like this. So now we wanted to try out those sealed ailerons and see if that improved, and do a few light aerobatics. And as you can see here, the ailerons are much more responsive than they were on the first day, and we didn't change the deflection at all. Simply sealing that gap made that much difference. And here we're just going to do a loop basically from level flight. We don't have a lot of power on tap with ours. It'd be a much more capable airplane with more power, but you can do the basics with the power that we had. On this landing, I properly used power and flare at the same time and actually got a smooth one. Here we're going to test out the gear mods on the geotextile. Nice smooth wheel landing on that rudder, and as the tail comes down, no problem hanging on to it. Let's do it again. This is not as good of a landing, but a good example of even on a bad one, you can hang on to it. The gear on the Savage Bobber is not really well suited for super rough stuff like this. This gravel drive coming into our club had just been re-graveled recently, and it hasn't been driven down, so there's a lot of big rocks, big for this airplane. But, you know, we're going to try it anyway. Whoops. Dang it, I thought I had that one. Hey, we got lucky and missed all the big rocks. Of course, I should have ended it on that one, but yeah, I'm not that smart. Alright, that was fun. That is where we were hoping to be able to get the Savage Bobber and the way we were hoping to be able to make it fly. And we got there, so that gives me the confidence now to show you our setup page. So you're going to see the equipment that we used as well as our full setup on the Savage Bobber. There are a couple of caveats. We wanted to make sure we had enough servo to make the airplane perform well and handle the flight loads, but we wanted to build and equip the airplane light if we could. You want to say with the same can size motor that we use, the can size that is suggested, if you go any bigger, you won't have clearance to mount the cowl. There's just barely enough room under that cowl the way it goes on with the motor as it is, so you have to stay with that can size. Within that can size, there are 1,000, 1,100, and I believe 1,200 available as far as KV is concerned. We bought the 1,000 with the biggest prop in the range. That is enough. It's enough power. It's scale power. But there's not a whole lot in reserve. If sport aerobatics are your thing, go with the 11 or 1200 kV and make more power. And you probably want to stay with 3-cell just to keep the airplane light. That's the other thing. We use a 3-cell 1000 milliamp pack, so a pretty light pack. Even with that light pack up front, we still needed to put a 1/4 ounce of weight back at the tail. We'll show you now where we put it. It is covered with electrical tape, so it's out of sight, out of mind, just kind of blends in with that framework. But even with a light pack, we had to add a little bit of weight to the tail to get the balance where we wanted it. And you can actually technically probably go back further, but I don't know how much good it would really do as far as flight performance, but you could try it. We like it where it is. So that said, here's the setup page. Pause it if you'd like, take a good look at it, and we'll see you back here, and we'll sum the Savage Bobber up. So, wrapping the HobbyKing Savage Bobber up, there are a lot of positives. I only see one real negative, and that is the gear. I would like to see the gear be a bit more robust or have some sort of articulating suspension. It's kind of easy to bend. I get why, and that's something that a lot of people don't really realize about ARFs, and that is that the labor to build an ARF. These are basically laser cut kits, and in the factory, somebody in the factory has to build that kit, cover it, and get it to the components that you put the electronics in, get it to ARF form. And the labor to build an airplane this size is the same as the labor to build that quarter scale Super Cub I've got sitting over there. And that's something a lot of people don't realize. So they cut costs on the smaller ones wherever they can, because they can't get as much to cover that labor for something this size. A lot of ARFs this size, companies are barely doing a little more than breaking even on something this size. So I get why they cut corners and they have lighter gauges of metal for gear and something like that with an airplane like this. But the one thing that I don't understand is why the gear is not farther forward. The original iteration of this had the gear back. This one has the gear back. I would like to see, in a perfect world, the gear be at least a little bit more robust, but at the very least, put it about a quarter to half an inch further forward and put the wing strut mounting brackets on the rear of the gear. I think if they did that, they would pretty much have the perfect little ARF. That's the only downside, and thankfully we were able to find a solution for that. That little shim took us 10 minutes to build and add to the airplane, and I mean, you saw the difference it made. It was huge. It did great off grass, it did great off of a smooth surface. So that is a very viable fix, and it's not hard to do. After you build it, adding that to your build is really nothing. So if you're an experienced builder and pilot, this is a great little airplane. If you're looking for a sports scale STOL plane that is kind of unique to add to your hangar, that doesn't take up a lot of space, easy to transport, easy to store, I think that's your huckleberry. When it comes to a newer person in the hobby, I think just because EPO and self-leveling and airplanes like Tundras, there's better trainers for your first airplane. So I would say that while you could certainly use this as a first airplane if you had proper guidance, EPO will make it a lot easier for you. I think this would be a good second airplane and an excellent first ARF for anybody that only has foamy experience and has never experienced anything like this. Things are so automated today. There are so many foamies that the instructions are so clear, they do so much testing, they have self-leveling, they have gyros, you follow the instructions, you take the 10 minutes to an hour to assemble it, whatever it takes, and you're off and running. And there are a lot of foamy pilots that start with that and they stay with that and they follow those instructions, and they've got a lot of airplanes in their hangar that they've done that with. And they think those airplanes fly well, and they may. But I don't think they realize just how much better it can get once you get some setup skill and some modeling skill. You're not afraid to tinker with things, and that is a huge advantage. One of the biggest advantages that I see to something like this. The Savage Bobber from HobbyKing is not expensive. It's not expensive to outfit, but it can give you a priceless amount of experience that a lot of model aviators don't have. They do a lot of the aviating, but they don't do a lot of the modeling. Taking the time to learn how to build an airplane like this, set it up, test it, feel things out, make a mod or two here and there to make it just the way you want it and get it really set up the way that you want it so that you're as happy with it as I am. When you gain the experience to do that, you have put so much in your modeling toolbox. And I'm telling you, if you don't know this, and anybody with experience will second this, they'll tell you, the more capable you are at the modeling part of model aviation, the better the aviating gets, because your planes fly better. You know how to get them to fly better. And that is the experience that you can gain with something like this. And I think it's a perfect first ARF candidate for those foamy flyers that are curious about balsa, but have never experienced the differences in how to get it together, how to outfit it, how to set it up, and how to fly it. Because it is different than foam in all aspects, somewhat. And gaining that experience and having that in your pocket, in your modeling toolbox, is a great thing. So that said, we really like it, really impressed with HobbyKing for making an iteration of this ARF that you can go right out and have success with, which is quite a change over what we've all seen. So I'm really happy about that, very impressed. We will put a link in the description where you can get yours at HobbyKing. We'll also put a link in the description to our build video so you can follow that if you'd like. Check this thing out. If you don't have the experience, get it. Perfect airplane to do it with. That said, happy flying. Thanks for watching, and please tune in next week when we will have something else cool with wings. Take care.